A cattle auctioneer was scrapping an old livestock scale when he found a metal canister welded inside, and reading what was in it, he stood there motionless. Lyle Colwell woke that Saturday before the clock said anything worth saying. 5:15, same as always. His body had its own alarm and didn't ask permission. He lay there a moment in the gray dark and listened to the house settle, the creak from the hallway where the floor dipped, the furnace cycling down with a click that had been the same click for 19 years. He thought about Margaret the way he did most mornings, the thought passing through the way a draft passes under a door. Brief, present, gone. The coffee mug on the window ledge above the sink was still hers. White, a small chip at the handle she'd meant to glue and never did. He never used it. He made his coffee in his own mug, blue enamel, and drank it standing at the window looking at his shop. He'd put the shop up 12 years ago, and Margaret had pretended to be annoyed about the size of it, and then brought him sandwiches every afternoon for 2 weeks while he was building it. The shop held his equipment, his old Ford 8N, a half-rebuilt IH baler that had become a long-term project, and everything else that made sense in a man's life. He had a neighbor, Dale Cutter, who drove his tractor up and down his driveway at random hours for reasons that were not clear to anyone. Dale had been doing it as long as Lyle could remember. Lyle had stopped wondering about it. In Cass County, you learned to accept that some things were simply how they were. He finished his coffee, set the mug on the counter. Margaret's mug stayed on the ledge, and took his reading glasses off his nose and left them on the newspaper he hadn't opened yet. Outside, the wind off the pasture north of the barns had already made its decision. Winter was staying a while longer. His cutting equipment was in the bed of the F-150, the acetylene tanks nested in their rack, the torch handle with the new tip he'd put on Thursday, the heavy leather apron, the welding gloves with the cracked right thumb he kept meaning to replace. He backed out of the driveway and thought about the gavel his father had given him the day he called his first auction. A simple hickory gavel, nothing fancy, but the weight of it in his hand had felt like a promise. He still had it on the workbench. He hadn't picked it up in 3 years. Some mornings he thought he would. Most mornings he didn't. The Cass County Fairgrounds sat on the east side of Harrisonville, and Lyle pulled through the gate just after 7. He climbed out of the F-150, and the wind off the open pasture cut straight through his jacket. He was 62 years old and still set up the same way he had at 25. Clean connections, no rushing, every fitting checked before the flame went on. The livestock scale had been sitting against the back fence for better than 10 years. Full platform scale, the old type, the kind you could run a full-size steer onto. The county had replaced it with a digital unit around 2013 and pushed the old one to the side, the way things get left when no one has the energy to haul them off. The fair board had asked Lyle to take it apart for scrap, knowing he had the equipment and wouldn't say no. He walked the scale first, the way he'd walk a piece of livestock, checking structure, figuring where to start. Platform was 6 feet by 8, steel plate about 3/8 of an inch thick. Frame underneath was built from heavy box steel, hollow square tubing welded into a grid. He'd take the platform off first, then work through the frame sections. He fired up the torch. Acetylene flame went blue-white, the steel glowed and ran, and the smell of burning metal came up sharp and clean. He'd always liked that smell. 35 years calling auctions, and before that, his father's equipment shop in Garden City. Cutting steel had always meant something was being solved. He worked through the corner welds, got the platform loose, wrestled it off to the side. Then he started on the frame sections. First crossmember came free, clean. Second, too. He was going section by section along the long side when the torch hit one of the main box steel members, and something made him stop. The metal didn't cut the same. Not the sound exactly, the resistance. More of it than there should have been. And when the cut opened on the top face, it didn't show the hollow interior the other sections had shown. It showed something bright. Stainless. Lyle pulled the torch back and cut the flame. He knelt and looked at the open cut. Inside the hollow frame member, fitted tight and welded in place, was a stainless steel tube. maybe 14 inches long, threaded cap on the end he could reach. He'd seen containers like this before. People used them to store documents, to protect paper from moisture and fire. Someone had fitted this canister inside the box steel and welded it there deliberately, at a time when the scale was accessible to be worked on. He took his time getting it free, cutting carefully so the heat didn't transfer to the tube, and after 20 minutes had it clear of the frame and sitting on the concrete pad. He unscrewed the cap. Inside, rolled tight in a clear plastic bag, was a sheaf of papers. He spread them on the platform section he'd already pulled off, holding the corners down with the canister and a section of steel. 2 sets of documents for each of 8 farms. Originals and something else. Copies, but not the same. Differences circled in red pen. Interest rates, payment schedules, penalty provisions. The 2 versions for each farm were clipped together, and on each clip was a label with a farmer's name in blue ink. He read through the names slowly. Harold Dunstan, Cecil Tanner, Wanda and Burl Stout, Dewey Gentry, Garland Phelps, Norbert and Irene Holloway, Mabel Bassett, Frank Ferris. He knew every one. He'd stood in his auction ring and called the sales when each of them couldn't hold on anymore. Harold Dunstan's Angus cattle on a Tuesday in October 12 years back. Cecil Tanner's red Herefords on a cold February morning the buyers hadn't wanted to drive out for. He'd called them all. He picked up Frank Ferris's pair and read them. The original showed a modification rate of 4.2%. The filed version showed 7.8%. On the original, no restructuring penalty. On the filed version, a $12,000 charge labeled late restructuring fee, dated 3 weeks before the modification. A penalty added retroactively to a document already signed. The wind blew grit across the papers, and Lyle pressed his hand flat on Frank Ferris's name and didn't move for a while. Frank had brought his herd to Lyle's ring about 3 years back. 112 head of mixed-breed cattle, well kept. Frank had stood at the rail in his work coat with his hands in his pockets and watched them go through without a word. Lyle had called that sale as straight as any he'd ever called. Frank had shaken his hand at the end and said thank you and driven away. 3 months after that, Frank Ferris was gone. Lyle looked at the notary stamps at the bottom of each page. Both were Cass County stamps, nearly identical, but the serial numbers differed. The original, 2-4471-C. The altered version, 2-4472-C. 1 digit off. He didn't open it yet. He stood on the empty concrete with the canister in one hand and Frank Ferris's documents in the other, and he understood. Somebody had made a second stamp, changed these documents after they were signed, sealed them with a counterfeit seal, and hidden the proof inside this scale, thinking no one would ever find it. Lyle rolled the documents, slid them back in the bag, screwed the canister cap tight, and loaded it behind the seat of his truck. He stacked his equipment, looked at the half-dismantled scale in the March wind, and thought about the 8 names on those paper clips. He got in the truck and drove home. When he pulled into his driveway, he sat with his hands on the wheel, looking at his workshop. The question forming in his chest already had an answer. The question wasn't whether to do something. The question was how fast. Because that for sale sign on County Road NW 700 had said commercial agricultural, and that meant somebody was already moving to sell what they'd stolen. And Oscar Keyes's name sat at the edge of his thinking like a thing that hadn't yet been said out loud. Lyle spread all 16 documents on his workbench at 8:45 that evening under the fluorescent shop lights. 1 original and 1 altered version for each of the 8 farms, laid side by side in a long row. He put on his reading glasses and went through each pair the way he'd go through consignment papers before an auction, checking every number, every date, every clause. The pattern was the same in every pair. Interest rates on the originals ran between 3.5% and 5%, consistent with the agricultural loan rates the state extension office had advertised during that period. The rates on the altered versions ran between 6.5% and 8.5%. Not so different that a stressed farmer would necessarily catch it at a glance, but enough to pile payments to a point where a man on a tight year couldn't make them. And then the penalties. Every altered version had provisions that didn't appear on the originals. Fees labeled Administrative Restructuring Assessment or Modified Terms Processing Fee, almost always backdated to before the modification was signed, which would make the loan instantly delinquent. A man would sign believing he was getting help and walk out already 3 months behind. Lyle photographed every document with his Polaroid, shot each page twice, and wrote the farm name on masking tape before setting each photograph aside. 32 photographs. He put the originals in the canister and locked it in his gun safe, bolted to the wall in the back corner of the shop. He stood looking at the manila envelope of photographs, then turned off the shop lights and went inside. He thought about the serial numbers on those notary stamps. 1 digit off. A notary stamp was a physical device. You had to have it made. If the number was wrong, it was because someone had ordered a second stamp with a wrong number on purpose, so the counterfeit documents would look official without matching county records exactly. You couldn't stumble into that. He slept maybe 4 hours. By 6, he was in the truck. The Cass County Courthouse in Harrisonville had been his destination for property searches many times. He pulled the loan records for all 8 farms, working through the basement filing system with the courthouse clerk. A small woman named Donna Schaefer, mid-40s, reading glasses on a beaded chain around her neck, who moved through the file drawers with the unhurried confidence of someone who had cataloged her own life by folder. She glanced at him over those glasses, but didn't stop him. Every filed version matched the altered documents from the canister. Not one original survived in the county's official records. Whoever had done this had been thorough. They'd replaced every filed version in the system. Then he searched the property records for Heartland Prairie Holdings. 8 farms, 1,200 acres total. Harold Dunstan's 200-acre farm, $78,000. Cecil Tanner's 185 acres, $71,500. The Ferris Farm, 160 acres, $82,000. A quarter of assessed value each time, at sheriff sales where Heartland Prairie was the only bidder. 8 farms. The registered agent was listed as Garfield and Moulton, attorneys at law, Kansas City. Lyle wrote it all down in a small spiral notebook and drove out of Harrisonville on County Road NW 700 on his way back. The white farmhouse had gone gray where the paint was peeling, porch boards soft in the middle. The barn roof line sagged in a long curve. The Osage orange trees Frank had always kept trimmed had gone their own way, trunks spread wide, branches crossed. At the end of the lane, for sale, commercial agricultural, Heartland Prairie Holdings. He didn't stop. Alma Ferris lived on the 2nd floor of a building on North Lexington Street in Harrisonville, above Caskey's Hardware. She was 76, white-haired, careful in her movements, with the particular stillness of a woman who had learned to be still and not fall apart at the same time. Lyle had known her most of his life. He knew what she'd looked like before Frank died, and the difference sat in her eyes. Not grief exactly. Not anymore, but the permanent afterstate of grief, the place a person settles when there is nothing left to be done about a thing. She answered on his first knock. The chain slid back. She looked at him the way a person looks at someone they're glad to see and sorry to see at the same time. She let him in without a word and went to put coffee on, moving to the kitchen counter with the measured deliberateness of someone for whom small actions had become anchors. A photograph of Frank sat on the windowsill above the radiator. The coffee can was the same brand Frank had bought. Alma. He waited until she'd sat down across from him. I need you to look at something. He set the Polaroid copies of Frank's 2 loan documents on the table between them. He pointed to the interest rate on the original. She picked it up, read it, set it down. Her hands were steady, picked up the altered version, held it at the same angle. The interest rate on what Frank signed. She said it quietly, like confirming a thing she'd half known. That's the rate he kept telling me about. He'd show me the papers and say, look, at 4% we can make this work. He ran the numbers so many times on a yellow legal pad. She looked at Frank's photograph. The other one, the one they filed. He never knew. No, Lyle said. He didn't. He died thinking he failed. Her voice was flat. The flatness of a thing that has been said in the head so many times it no longer costs anything to say aloud. He didn't fail. They put him in an impossible position on purpose. He signed one document and they filed a different one. She looked at the 2 pages lying side by side on her kitchen table. They killed him, Lyle, not with a bullet, but they killed him. There are 7 other families, he said. Same thing, every one. A company called Heartland Prairie Holdings bought all 8 farms at share of sales. The farm's up for sale right now to a corporate operation. If that sale goes through, then Frank never gets his land back, Alma said. And whoever did this walks away with $6 million. That's right. She folded her hands. What do you need from me? Right now, I need you to know what I found, and I need you to stay quiet until we know more. She nodded once. I've been quiet for 3 years. I can stay quiet a while longer. Lyle drove home through the early dark. He thought about Alma's words, not with a bullet, and about whoever had welded those documents inside the scale, thinking the truth was buried so deep no cutting torch would ever reach it. He needed a lawyer outside the county system who had dealt with agricultural lending fraud before. He needed her fast, because somewhere a corporate law firm was already doing paperwork on a $6 million deal. And when he pulled onto his road, he saw a light on at the neighbor's barn and thought, 45 days is not much time, and the clock was already running. June Mercer's office was on the 12th floor of a building on Broadway in Kansas City, but the first thing Lyle noticed was the print behind her desk. A Winslow Homer, 2 men working with scythes, and the bookshelf holding agricultural extension bulletins, county soil surveys, and a Missouri Farm Bureau report on rural lending practices that Lyle had read himself. He decided he was in the right place. June was about 40, lean and direct, with reading glasses pushed up on her head and the deliberate economy of someone who had trained herself to never waste emotion. She had a farm background. Family had farmed outside Lexington before the '93 floods took the bottomland, and she mentioned it the way you mention something that shaped you, not the way you mention something you've moved past. Her voice had the flat prairie directness of a woman who said what she meant and did not embellish, and Lyle recognized it the way you recognize someone who grew up speaking the same language. He laid the canister documents on her table, the courthouse copies beside them, the Polaroid photographs in a row. Then he sat back and let her work. She didn't say anything for 8 minutes. She read every pair with her glasses down, going back and forth between originals and alterations, making notes on a yellow legal pad. When she finished, she set the glasses on the table. 8 farms. Yes. Same pattern each time. Rate change plus a phantom penalty that's backdated. And every filed version at the courthouse matches the altered copies. She tapped her pen against the pad. This is a strong case. The documents speak for themselves. But the Heartland Prairie Holdings records, who's named as principal? Registered agent is Garfield and Moulton in Kansas City. No individual listed as owner. That's the gap. We can prove the fraud happened. But to void the sheriff's sales and bring criminal charges, we need to connect Heartland Prairie to a specific individual. She looked at him steadily. Who do you think did this? Former county agricultural loan officer, Oscar Keyes, held the position 18 years, handled every one of these modifications. Retired 3 years ago, sits on the Farm Bureau board now. He said the last part without inflection. We need more than suspicion. We need a direct connection. She looked at the documents laid across her conference table. Tell me about the notary stamps. Lyle explained the 1-digit difference. June sat very still. A counterfeit notary seal. If a forensic examiner confirms it, that changes the charges considerably. A changed number can be argued as clerical error. A machined counterfeit seal is deliberate fabrication. She wrote something on the legal pad. Here's the problem. We have a case, but we have a clock. She slid a printed legal notice across the table. The sale of Heartland Prairie Holdings to Consolidated Livestock Ventures closes in 45 days. Once that land transfers to a corporate buyer who paid good faith value, unwinding the fraud becomes almost impossible. So we move fast, Lyle said. We move fast. I'll file a civil complaint on the fairest foreclosure first, the clearest documentation, the most compelling story. Get that in the system. While it's pending, we work on the Keys connection. She paused. Don't say anything to anyone yet. Keys has contacts in this county. That was Wednesday. By Thursday afternoon, Lyle had reason to remember what June had said. He was in Caskey's Hardware below Alma's apartment when his phone rang. Unknown number. Lyle. The voice was warm, easy. This is Oscar Keys. I heard through the grapevine you were doing some research at the courthouse, property records and such. Wanted to call and say hello, see if you were maybe thinking about getting into the land business. I'm not getting into the land business, Lyle said. Well, I figured I'd ask. A brief pause that cost nothing. How's everything going for you? Fine, Lyle said. Everything's fine. Good to hear it. You take care now. 45 seconds. Lyle stood in the hardware store and thought, that is a man who already knows. He knows someone pulled the Heartland Prairie records, he knows it was me, and he called to see if I'd give something away. He gave nothing away. He set his concrete screws on the counter. Mitch Caskey rang them up, broad-shouldered, good-natured in the way of men who've operated from a fixed position long enough to confuse familiarity for trust. He had a habit of repeating county gossip as though repeating it constituted analysis. Heard the Heartland Prairie lands almost sold. Corporate operation coming in. Ought to be good for the county. You on the Farm Bureau board, Mitch? Lyle asked. 15 years, Mitch said, pleased. Good for you, Lyle said, and picked up his screws. He told Alma about the call that evening. She sat with her coffee cup in both hands and listened without moving. When he finished, she set the cup down on the table, a small sound in a quiet room. He knew you were looking, she said. He has someone in the clerk's office. Then her phone buzzed on the counter. She looked at it, set it down. Property management, rent increase, $200 a month starting April. She didn't look at the phone again. Mitch Caskey manages this building. He and Keys have been on the Farm Bureau board together for 15 years. That isn't a coincidence, Lyle said. He drove home through a cold night. $200 on a Social Security check was not a small thing. It was a message, quiet and deniable, applied where a widow lived. It also told him something. Keys was worried. A man who wasn't worried didn't make this kind of move. Keys had found out about the courthouse visit within hours and responded the same day. Fast, precise, personal. He called June that night. We need to move faster. I know, I'm filing Monday, but I still need the Keys connection. Without it, he'll claim the company belongs to someone else. I'll find it, Lyle said, flat and certain. And then he sat looking at the dark outside his window and thought about what else Keys might do once he understood not just that someone had been to the courthouse, but that Lyle had the canister, the originals themselves, the proof of what had really been signed. $200 on a rent check would not be the end of it. June filed the civil complaint Monday morning, just as she'd promised. By Tuesday afternoon, Lyle had the 32-page filing in his hands, precise and thorough, backed by the paired documents and courthouse records, and read it at his kitchen table thinking it felt like solid ground, like something a man could stand on. That feeling lasted about 3 days. The motion came from a Kansas City firm he'd never heard of, representing Consolidated Livestock Ventures, LLC. It argued that the civil complaint threatened a legitimate commercial transaction and asked the court to deny any temporary restraining order that might impede the sale. It used words like opportunity and consolidation and improved efficiency applied to 8 farms stolen from their families. And Lyle's jaw set hard reading it. The judge issued his ruling on a Thursday. He declined the temporary restraining order. The court accepted the complaint and scheduled a hearing. but declined to halt the sale pending resolution. A good faith purchaser's rights had to be considered. The complaint raised serious questions that would be addressed at hearing. The court was not in a position to halt a major agricultural transaction on a preliminary filing. June set the ruling down on her desk. It's not over. I know it's not over. Lyle was still, the stillness of a man recalculating, not giving up. What does this mean for the timeline? The sale can proceed during litigation. We prove the fraud and win before closing, or the land goes into corporate hands, and the equitable remedies become significantly harder. She looked at him across the desk. I need the Keys connection. If I can tie him directly to Heartland Prairie, I can petition for an emergency asset freeze on him personally. That freezes the sale. Without it, the company is just a company. He drove home through a gray sky that hadn't made up its mind all week. The Missouri countryside between seasons. Last year's fields brown, new grass just starting underneath, the tree lines bare and waiting. He'd driven this road more times than he could count. It ran along the eastern edge of what had been the Dunstan farm, and he could see the fence line Harold had kept tight for 40 years now gone slack on the posts. He stopped at the IGA for milk. Norma Gentry was at the checkout. Dewey Gentry's wife. Dewey had been one of the 8 names. Dark eyes, the tiredness of someone carrying a weight they'd gotten used to carrying. She asked how they were getting on, bagged his items herself. We're in Peculiar now, she said. Dewey does mechanic work when he can get it. She looked at him directly. He goes a certain way to town just to avoid passing the farm. She shook her head. I don't know what can be done about it, Lyle, but I hope somebody figures something out. He didn't tell her what he knew. He drove home with the milk and thought about Dewey Gentry finding a different route so he didn't have to look at his own land. That night, close to midnight, his telephone rang. Alma. Crying but quiet about it. Lyle, I found something. He waited. In Frank's desk. The one I brought from the farm and never went through properly. I kept putting it off. A pause. He wrote me a letter. The week before he died. Addressed it to me but never mailed it. I want to read it to you. Go ahead, Lyle said. She read it. Frank's voice coming through Alma's over the phone line. A letter from a man who had already made his decision. Frank wrote about the farm, about the land his father worked and his grandfather before that. He wrote about going to the county loan office to ask why the payments were what they were, why the penalty was on there, why the numbers didn't match what he remembered signing. The officer told him the terms were standard, that this was how loan modifications worked, that nothing was wrong. Frank wrote, I believed him. I shouldn't have believed him. He sat behind that desk and told me everything was standard, and I believed him because why would a county officer lie to a man about his own loan? Why would a man do that to another man? The letter ended. I let you down, Alma. I let the farm down. I'm sorry for everything I couldn't do and couldn't see and couldn't fix. I love you more than you'll ever know. I am sorry. Lyle listened. He didn't speak for a moment after she finished. Alma, can you keep that letter safe? Yes. Keep it somewhere you trust. Don't show it to anyone yet. He said goodnight, put his coat on, and walked outside into the cold March dark. The sky was clear and full of stars, the kind of sky you only see away from any city, standing in the middle of farmland with nothing between you and the horizon in any direction. He stood with his hands in his pockets and the cold working through his jacket and the cattle pen smell of his neighbor's lot drifting over on the wind. Frank Ferris had gone to ask about the numbers on his own loan. He'd gone to the very man who'd changed them. The man had looked him in the face across a county desk and told him the forged terms were legitimate and unavoidable. The system built to protect farmers had been turned into the weapon used against them. He didn't open it yet. He stood there with the letter in his head and the stars above and thought about a man going to the county loan office, believing the county was on his side. Then Key sent word through a mutual acquaintance. He was willing to let Alma stay at the current rent if the whole matter went away quietly. Let it settle. Move on. That was the closest Lyle came to walking away, not because he was tempted, but because the offer showed him how completely Keyes had misread him. 35 years in an auction ring, and not once had Lyle let a dishonest bid stand. He'd lost commissions doing it. He'd made enemies doing it. He'd do it again. He called Bert Holloway the next morning. Norbert and Irene Holloway had been on the list. Their farm was outside Garden City, 15 miles southwest of Harrisonville. "Bert, I need to talk to you and your parents. Can you come out to my shop this week?" A pause. "What's this about?" "It's about your family's farm," Lyle said. "And what happened to it?" Silence on the line. Then, quietly, "Yeah, we can come out." The Holloways came to Lyle's shop on a Thursday evening, all three of them. Norbert was 71 now and moved carefully, the way men move when a lifetime of work has settled into their joints. But his eyes were clear and his handshake firm. Irene sat straight in the folding chair and watched everything with the watchfulness of a woman who had learned not to let things go past unexamined. She had a habit of tilting her head slightly when she was deciding something, just a few degrees, like a pendulum finding center, and Lyle had noticed it within the first 5 minutes and understood it meant she was the one whose judgment you wanted. Bert stood near the workbench with his arms crossed and said little while his parents settled. Lyle laid out what he knew: the canister, the paired documents, the courthouse records, Heartland Prairie Holdings, June's complaint, the clock on the sale. He did not mention Alma's letter. That was Alma's to share. When he finished, Norbert looked at the copies of his own loan documents for a long time. He turned the wrench over in his hands. He'd picked it up from the bench when he sat down without seeming to notice, and turned it over again. "We kept ours," he said. "The originals. I kept every piece of paper that had to do with that loan from the day we applied. I've still got them in a file box at Bert's house. I kept them because I never did understand the numbers." "Your copies," Lyle said, "would they match the originals in the canister?" "If what you're telling me is right, they would." Norbert set the wrench down. "Because I signed those papers. I know what they said. And what we were paying did not match what I signed." Irene spoke quietly, her head tilted. "I told Norbert at the time the payment schedule didn't look right. We called the loan office twice. Both times the loan officer told us the terms were standard. He said if we didn't believe him, we could have an attorney review the documents. We didn't have money for an attorney." She paused. "That's why we were in a loan modification in the first place." Bert said from the workbench, "Do you want Dad's copies?" "I want them very much. Make copies before you give them to me, and keep your copies somewhere other than your house." He spent the next 2 weeks driving. Harold Dunstan had moved to his daughter's house in Belton, in his late 70s and moving slowly. But he knew exactly where his papers were. His daughter Patricia fetched the file box, and Harold sat beside Lyle for 2 hours, tapping each page and saying, "This is right, this here is right, this one is wrong." Cecil Tanner was in Nevada, Missouri, not Nevada the state, he always had to explain, and met Lyle at his kitchen table. Garland Phelps had moved to Kansas City, working nights at a warehouse, and met Lyle at a Denny's at 7 in the morning before his shift, wearing a reflective vest and boots with the laces half loose, and drank black coffee and talked in the flat, steady voice of a man who had thought about this for a long time and had his words ready. He did not look out the window once the whole conversation. 6 of the 8 families had documentation from the original loan process. 3 had complete original copies, enough to constitute independent corroboration. Norbert Holloway's file box was the clearest. Every page, every initial, every signature. The original rate and terms unmistakable. A mirror of the canister documents and a precise contradiction of what had been filed. Lyle brought everything to June. She stood over it for 15 minutes without speaking. "This changes everything," she said. "That's what I figured." 3 independent originals, consistent with your canister documents, and inconsistent with the filed versions. This is not one farmer's word against a county officer. This is a pattern from multiple independent sources across 12 years. She was already writing. Irene Holloway's account of being told the terms were standard, that's fraud described by a witness who heard it. The Holloways can identify Keys. They can say it was the man at the loan office. I need that on record. What about the shell company? Lyle told her about Bert. At the sheriff's sale for the Holloway farm, only one bidder had appeared. Bert had been there watching. He remembered the bidder's representative, a woman in a business suit with a folder of typed papers who had introduced herself to the auctioneer before the bidding began. Bert had heard the name clearly. He said her name was Colette Brandt, Lyle said. He is certain. June wrote the name and turned to her desk. She pulled up the Missouri Secretary of State's records for Garfield and Moulton on the computer. The firm's website listed legal staff. One secretary handled real estate and corporate registration. Her name was Colette Brandt. June sat back. Garfield and Moulton represents Heartland Prairie Holdings, and Garfield and Moulton represents Oscar Keys personally. Same firm. One of their secretaries represented Heartland Prairie at the sheriff's sales. That is the connection. That's the connection, Lyle agreed. June filed the amended complaint the following Monday. Fraud, forgery, and conspiracy added to the original counts. An emergency petition for asset freeze on all Heartland Prairie properties, the pending sale included. She named Oscar Keys as controlling individual and documented the connection through the law firm. Wallace Tate, a forensic document examiner from St. Louis, had already submitted his analysis of the counterfeit notary seal, and June included it as an exhibit. The night before the filing, Lyle made 4 complete copies of everything. He drove to Kansas City at 10 that night and left a copy with June's overnight box. He put one in a safe deposit box at Commerce Bank in Lee's Summit. He locked one in his gun safe. The 4th he brought to Alma the next morning. Keep this somewhere they won't look, he told her. She held the envelope. What happens now? When that filing hits the record, Keys is going to have his lawyers moving within an hour. I want to make sure it doesn't matter what he does. He looked at her. Lock your door. Don't let anyone you don't know in. I've been careful my whole life, Alma said quietly. It didn't save Frank. No. But what we're doing now still might save his land. She looked at him from the doorway with the envelope in both hands. Then, file it. I've been waiting 3 years for someone to tell the truth about what was done to him. File it today. He called June from the parking lot. File it. I've called too many auctions where good men lost everything watching their cattle go. I am not letting this one go. Already on my way in, June said. It hits the docket at 9. The hearing was set for a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the emergency petition was filed. The Cass County Courthouse opened at 8, and Lyle was on the steps at 7:30 with June beside him, an accordion file under her arm, and a clear, cold April sky above them that smelled of turned earth. The hallway outside courtroom 2 was standing room. 8 families had reason to be there, and most of them were. Norbert Holloway squeezed Lyle's hand and said nothing, which was enough. Cecil Tanner had driven up from Nevada in a truck that needed a muffler. Harold Dunstan stood with his son-in-law, both men with the look of people who had waited a long time for a room like this. Patricia Bassett sat with Mabel's nurse, there to speak for the family. Garland Phelps stood near a window in clean work clothes, looking at the courthouse floor the way men look when they're in a building they never expected to be in. And Elma was there. She sat at the end of a bench with her hands folded over her purse, back straight, face composed. She wore a dark blue coat Lyle had never seen before. Lyle stopped beside her. She looked up and nodded once, and that was all that needed to pass between them. Oscar Keys arrived at 8:45 with 2 lawyers from a large Kansas City firm, not Garfield and Moulton. Someone had advised him to put visible distance from Heartland Prairie's counsel now that the connection was on the public record. Keys was a big man, well-built, with the complexion of golf courses rather than fields. He wore a gray suit and moved through the hallway with the particular ease of a man who had been the most important person in every room he'd entered for 30 years. He glanced at Lyle once as he walked past. Neutral, almost casual, the glance of a man who considered himself unaccountable, and went through the courtroom door. Judge Constance Aldridge had been on the circuit 11 years. She ran a tight courtroom and had read the filings before she came in. June presented the paired documents. She put both versions of the Ferris loan under the document viewer, and the projector screen showed them side by side. She went through the differences one by one. The rate change from 4.2 to 7.8%, the backdated $12,000 penalty, the fabricated delinquency date. She said the numbers and let them sit. Then she showed the same pattern for all 8 farms, 8 pairs under the lights, 8 sets of red pen circles, until the pattern was not an allegation, but a visible, repeated fact. Keyes' lead attorney, a man named Sherwood with silver hair styled to look trustworthy, argued that the canister documents could have been fabricated. The canister was of unknown provenance. The entire case rested on documents found by one individual under circumstances that couldn't be independently verified. June let him finish. She called Norbert Holloway to the stand. He sat with deliberate care. She asked him to describe his original loan modification. He described it from memory. The rate, the payment schedule, the absence of any penalty. His hands were on the railing in front of him, still, like a man who had decided before he walked in that he was going to be still. June introduced his original copy. It matched the canister original exactly and contradicted what had been filed. Sherwood cross-examined at length, but couldn't shake Norbert on the essential fact. He knew what he had signed. Patricia Bassett, for her mother Mabel, the original copy showed 3.8% and no penalties. The filed version showed 6.9% and an $8,000 processing fee. Patricia read from her mother's copy in a steady voice and didn't look at Keyes. Garland Phelps gave his testimony in the flat, direct voice of a man who doesn't need to add anything. His copy matched his canister original. He described being told by the loan officer that the terms were standard. He did not look at Keyes once. 3 families, 3 independent sets of documentation, 3 consistent accounts of being told the fraudulent terms were legitimate. Sherwood argued the families had coordinated under Lyle's influence. Judge Aldridge asked, over her reading glasses, whether he was suggesting 3 separate families had fabricated original loan documents years before any investigation. Sherwood retreated. Then June called Wallace Tate, the forensic examiner from St. Louis. 30 years in the work, the unhurried manner of a man who has explained complicated things in plain language many times. He had examined the notary stamps under magnification and chemical analysis. A legitimate seal was cast, die casting process. The stamp used on the altered documents had been machined, cut on a milling machine, measurably different at the microscopic level. The serial number difference, 1 digit, was inconsistent with any manufacturing variation in legitimate stamp production. The counterfeit seal had been used on all 8 sets of altered documents over a period of years. The courtroom went very quiet. Is there any explanation for these findings other than deliberate fabrication? June asked. No, Wallace Tate said. A machined counterfeit notary seal does not exist by accident. It has to be designed, ordered, and manufactured. The person using it knew exactly what it was. Sherwood's cross-examination produced nothing except the impression of a man making noise in the absence of a genuine answer. Judge Aldridge called a recess. When she returned, she granted the emergency asset freeze from the bench. All Heartland Prairie properties frozen. The sale to Consolidated Livestock Ventures halted. She cited the forensic evidence as the determining factor. The counterfeit seal crossed from civil fraud into criminal forgery, and the public interest outweighed the commercial interests of the transaction. Keyes sat at the defense table and did not move. the same composed, unhurried face that had probably sat behind a county loan desk and told 8 farmers that the terms were standard. In the hallway afterward, a woman in a dark coat introduced herself to June. Missouri Attorney General's office. The AG's investigative division was opening a formal criminal inquiry. The next morning, before 6, 2 men from the county sheriff's department and 1 from the attorney general's office knocked on Oscar Keyes's door on Elm Street. They arrested him on charges of loan fraud, forgery, and 8 counts of theft by deception. He walked out in his house clothes with his hands behind his back and said nothing. The criminal trial was held at the Jackson County Circuit Court in Kansas City 5 months after the arrest. The defense had argued that the coverage in Cass County made an impartial jury impossible, so Lyle drove to Kansas City every day the trial was in session and sat in the gallery with Norbert Holloway, Cecil Tanner, and Garland Phelps and watched the state lay out the full 12 years. The prosecutors were thorough. They covered every farm, every modification, every altered document, every sheriff's sale, every acquisition by Heartland Prairie Holdings. They brought in state agricultural lending records showing the original canister documents were consistent with market rates, while the filed versions were not. They showed that Heartland Prairie Holdings had been incorporated 6 months before the first fraudulent modification was processed, meaning Keyes had built the machinery of the theft before the first farmer walked into his office. He had set up the company to receive stolen land before he had stolen it. The defense raised the same arguments from the civil hearing. The documents could have been fabricated. The connection between Keyes and Heartland Prairie was circumstantial. The alterations might have been made by another employee. Sherwood argued it again with the dogged persistence of a man who understood he was losing. The prosecution's decisive answer came from an unexpected source. A woman named Edna Spurlock took the stand. 67 years old, the Cass County Fair Board's administrative secretary for 22 years. She kept the board's meeting minutes and maintenance records in binders, had always kept them, and she came to the stand with one of those binders in her lap, held carefully the way she held everything she was responsible for. She testified that 10 years ago, the livestock scale had been temporarily moved off its concrete pad during a county maintenance project. 4 days when the scale sat in the equipment barn rather than on the fairgrounds floor. She had the work order, the meeting minutes, and the sign-in log for the equipment barn during those 4 days, which showed 3 entries for authorized personnel. One was Oscar Keyes on the fair board at the time, who had signed in to inspect equipment as part of his board responsibilities. He had been in that barn, alone with that livestock scale, for 2 hours and 40 minutes. The prosecution asked how she was certain of the year. She said it was the same week her sister had come from Joplin, and she had noted it in her personal calendar, insurance company calendar, the kind with small squares, with the entry in her handwriting on the correct date. She produced the calendar. Sherwood cross-examined her for 45 minutes. He did not dent her. The jury deliberated a day and a half and came back on a Friday afternoon. The foreman read the verdicts in a flat, measured voice. Guilty on 8 counts of theft by deception. Guilty on 8 counts of forgery. Guilty on 8 counts of agricultural loan fraud. Guilty on 7 counts of filing false official documents. 31 counts. Guilty on every one. Oscar Keyes sat very still while the verdicts were read, looking straight ahead. The same composed face, Lyle thought, that had sat across a county desk and told Frank Ferris the terms were standard and there was nothing to be done. Not a face that changed because circumstances changed. The face of a man who had decided a long time ago he was beyond consequence. Now he was finding out otherwise, and he received that information with the same expression he'd carried through 12 years of theft. Sentencing came 3 weeks later. 15 years in state prison, a fine of $240,000, restitution of $3.8 million, the difference between assessed values of the 8 farms at the time of the sheriff's sales and what Heartland Prairie Holdings had paid. The judge ordered all 8 foreclosure sales voided and directed the court to begin returning the farms to their original owners or surviving families. Norbert Holloway made a sound when the sentencing was announced, deep in his chest after a very long time carrying a very heavy thing. Not a cheer, not a cry. The sound of weight being set down after so long you'd forgotten what it felt like not to carry it. After sentencing, one of the prosecutors told Lyle and June what the forensic accountants had found. In the months before the arrest, Keyes had transferred $1.4 million out of Heartland Prairie into personal accounts and had begun moving a portion to a bank out of state. The restitution order attached to those accounts, but it told Lyle something he'd already suspected. Keyes had known exposure was coming. The phone call fishing for information, Alma's rent increase, the quiet pressure applied through the hardware store owner. Keyes had been accelerating toward the sale and preparing for flight at the same time. He had been 2 months from being gone when Lyle's cutting torch hit the canister. 2 months. And 10 years of careful work before that, in an office where farmers came to him for help. The process of returning the farms took several more months. Deed transfers, title clearances, probate where the original owner had died. Courts move at the pace courts move. Lyle drove where he needed to drive, waited where he needed to wait, pushed when pushing was appropriate. The Ferris farm transfer came through in early November. The court issued the deed transferring 160 acres on County Road North W700 to the estate of Frank Ferris, with Alma Ferris as surviving heir. June called Lyle when the paperwork was done. He drove to Harrisonville on a gray November morning, climbed the stairs above Caskey's Hardware, and knocked on Alma's door. He stepped inside and set the envelope on her kitchen table. She opened it, read every word carefully, set it flat on the table and pressed both hands on it, on Frank's name and the parcel number and the description of 160 acres on County Road North W700, and she closed her eyes. Lyle sat across the table. Outside, the hardware store sign moved in the November wind and made a small sound against its bracket. The kitchen was quiet and the coffee was on the burner. Alma opened her eyes. She lifted the deed with both hands and held it. Not quickly, not with ceremony. The way you hold something that belongs to you, that has been gone a long time, and that you are not yet ready to put down. Lyle sat with her. Neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left that words could add. Oscar Keyes was transported to the Missouri Eastern Correctional Center in Pacific, Missouri, in the spring following sentencing. Heartland Prairie Holdings was dissolved by court order in December, and the Kansas City law firm that had served as its registered agent was referred to the Missouri Office of Chief Disciplinary Counsel. The firm closed voluntarily before the disciplinary proceedings concluded. The Cass County Farm Bureau established an independent agricultural loan review committee and removed Keyes' name from the plaque in the lobby where donor members were listed. The Missouri General Assembly introduced a bill mandating dual notary verification on all agricultural loan modifications processed through county offices. It passed in the following legislative session and was signed into law that June. The livestock scale at the fairgrounds was never reassembled. The scrap steel was donated to the welding program at Cass County Technical High School, where a second-year student named Devlin Phelps, Garland Phelps's nephew, used a section of the old platform in his end-of-year fabrication project without knowing what it was. Alma Ferris moved back to the farm on County Road Northwest 700 in January. The white farmhouse needed paint, the porch boards replacing, every room a thorough cleaning after years standing empty. She hired 2 brothers from her church for the structural work while she did the rest herself. The barn roof was rebuilt in early spring by a crew Harold Dunstan's son-in-law knew, and by May it was sound again. She leased the 160 acres to a young couple named Cal and Ruthie Eaton, starting a grass-fed cattle operation of the kind Frank had always believed in. Small, careful, built to last rather than scale. She tended the row of Osage orange trees along the east fence line that Frank's grandfather had planted in 1920, trimming them back to the clean line Frank had always kept, so that by summer they stood straight the way they had when Frank was alive. She put Frank's unmailed letter in a frame and hung it on the wall of the front room beside their wedding photograph. She did not read it again. She knew what it said. Lyle Colwell drove his welding truck to the Cass County Fairgrounds on a cool October evening, the light going gold before it went, and shadows running long across the open ground. The space where the livestock scale had stood was empty now, just a concrete pad with 8 anchor bolt holes and a rust stain where the steel had bled into the concrete over the years. He parked at the fence line and walked to the pad and stood on it. He remembered every auction he had called at this fairgrounds. He remembered Frank Ferris, the work coat, the hands in the pockets, the handshake after the sale that said everything Frank couldn't say out loud. The wind came across from the north and carried the smell of hay and cold earth. Lyle stood on the pad where the scale had been, where 12 years of stolen weight had waited in steel for a cutting torch and a man who wouldn't look away from what he found. He stood there until the gold went out of the light. Then he walked back to his truck and drove home.